Hi, this is Tom Needham, and you're listening to The Sounds of Film. And I'm very excited to be speaking with Carol Roth today on the program. She's the author of You Will Own Nothing. In this book, Roth reveals how world governments, globalist organizations, big tech, Wall Street, and other powerful elites are proactively trying to control every finite resource and determining who has access to such resources. The book is an essential guide to stopping the elite's agenda and taking control to preserve your and your family's wealth and freedom. Carol Roth is a recovering investment banker. She's an entrepreneur, TV pundit and host, speaker, economic business and financial commentator, and content developer. She's also a New York Times best-selling author. She's been seen weekly on a variety of national television outlets over the years, including Fox Business, CNN, CNBC, HBO, Fox News, and MSNBC. Carol, thank you so much for joining us today on Sounds of Film to talk about You Will Own Nothing.
Thanks so much for having me, Tom. Looking forward to this.
Oh, yeah, me too. Some people are very familiar with this phrase, you will own nothing, and love it, and some people are not at all. For those people that are not, can you explain the origin of the phrase, exactly what it means?
So the first time I encountered the extended phrase, which is "you'll own nothing and you'll be happy," was floating around social media several years ago. And as so often happens on social media, you look at something and you go, that was probably taken out of context, or there's no way that was being said. And from my perspective, it was being said ostensibly by the World Economic Forum, which is an organization that is littered with the business and political elite. So I'm like, I don't really think that this group is predicting the end of private property, by the year 2030. But for this particular case, it took me very little research to track it down. And in fact, it's still on their Twitter, or I guess we're now calling it X.com site and feed. And it's a video with their top 8 predictions for 2030. It's from their global future councils. And it says, number one, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. And as somebody who has stood for wealth creation opportunities and been an advocate for that for more than a quarter of a century, it was really concerning to me because I know that wealth comes from ownership. You have to own assets. You have to own assets in particular that store their value or hopefully appreciate in value. So the idea that they're trying to sell you on this concept of owning nothing and then pretending you're going to be happy from it definitely raised a red flag.
Well, as we mentioned before, you have a long history of discussing business ideas on mainstream media. When one starts discussing global elites and their plan for a new financial world order, you start to go into territory that some people will label conspiratorial. Were you afraid at all of delving into this material and that some people might label you a conspiracy theorist?
Yeah, I actually leaned into that because I wanted to take the conspiracy element out of this everywhere I could. And there are more than 600 sources, most of them mainstream media in the book or from the proverbial horse's mouth. I let those people do the talking for themselves. And actually, my book trailer basically says conspiracy has now become reality, and I take these ideas that are supposedly conspiratorial, and then I show you the news headlines, from 60 Minutes, from the New York Times, from Wall Street Journal, where they're repeating these things. So if you take something like the new world order, the new financial world order, I mean, boy, that does sound like a conspiracy theory. But if you want to go on the White House's website, you can look at the speech that President Biden gave to the Business Roundtable, which, if you're not familiar with that, is the CEOs of the largest companies in the United States, most of the publicly traded companies, and so on and so forth. March 21st, 2022, he explains this all very clearly. He says that every 3 or 4 generations there is a shift in the global financial order, and we are 80 years into us being at the center of the global financial universe, holding the global reserve currency. But before us, it was Britain, and before Britain was the Dutch. And then he goes on to say there's going to be a new world order out there, and we've got to lead it. So, if you're going to call me a conspiracy theorist, then you have to call the President of the United States a conspiracy theorist, and all of these other country leaders and folks around the world who are talking about these things that really are just history rhyming and don't have any conspiratorial element to it whatsoever. So I relish when anybody wants to talk about the conspiracy, and then I can point them to the actual facts and where everything came from, and say, okay, what part of this do you find conspiratorial? And that usually makes for a spirited conversation.
It's funny. This show has been on the air for a very long time, and through the years, uh, many of our listeners, I found out, were collectors of things like Blu-ray movies and DVDs and books, CDs, vinyl, you name it. But in recent years, through discussions, I've been finding that's becoming less and less common. And people are telling me that they're streaming their music through Spotify, or now they stopped buying DVDs and they're watching Netflix or one of the streaming channels. Same thing even with books. I used to love going into people's houses and they would have all their books on display. And now you go in someone's house, there's no books, there's no CDs, there's nothing like that. There's no material objects. And this is one of the, I guess, lesser points that you're making in the book, but it's a real life example that I think a lot of people will relate to, that they're really starting to not own a lot of things, not even the big things, but even the little things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's how it starts, right? It's a slow creep. You sort of train people on, well, you don't need all of this clutter. And, in the case of, these pieces of art, I'll make an argument in a moment that you probably would want to have some of those. But, it's not the same as an investment that retains its value. But I do think that that's sort of the gateway is when you give up on ownership of those things and you're used to having your entire life rented to you as a subscription or a service. When they come in and they want to do it for the seats in your car or eventually your home, it's not as much of a leap for you to make because you've been sort of quote unquote decluttering your life, not realizing what you give up in the process. For something like these works of art, whether it's books or films or whatnot, I think the big concern is over artistic integrity. Is that, I know what I put in this particular copy of the book. I have flipped through the hard copy. It is in agreement with the things that I wrote. But as we know, they have been rewriting all kinds of books and just taking things out of films and editing them. And so the kind of original vision, the authenticity of that art, the way the artist intended it, really is in jeopardy. And the only way to preserve that is by people having those copies the way they were done originally in their collections. So I think that's something important to think about. Obviously, when you get to the point of taking that from a book or a film to home ownership, it has lots of implications. One on the wealth side in terms of removing the biggest asset on people's balance sheets across the United States and the wealth creation opportunities, but also the personal sovereignty. If you start to live with somebody else as the landlord, then they get to dictate the rules for you, and so you don't have as much agency or freedom or that personal sovereignty if you are in somebody else's house.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I was wondering if you could speak to that just a little bit more. You said that in the book that the American dream is under attack and that you mentioned home ownership. You talk about companies like BlackRock that are literally going around and they're buying up homes. Some people know about this, a lot of people don't. They're actually accounting for a huge percentage of all homes bought, and they're turning them into rental properties. And if this kind of action continues, we might reach a point, like you were kind of hinting at, where people won't own homes anymore.
Yeah, the housing situation in the U.S., particularly for young home buyers and first-time home buyers, but really anybody who's looking even to get out of a home and make a trade is very dire right now. And a lot of that has been done by policy. Out of the Great Recession financial crisis, after they bailed out Wall Street, but forced almost 6 million individuals to sell their homes, whether that was foreclosure or short sale, give them up and give up that equity. there was, not only widely different outcomes, but the policy that followed that enabled a bunch of cheap capital, which primarily benefited Wall Street. And what the folks on Wall Street did with that is they bid up every asset class that you can think of. And so you had a bubble in all different kinds of assets in the market. And then they ended up turning their attention to single family homes. And this is one of the probably most staggering pieces of research that I noted when I was doing the book. And I say this as a financial commentator, who was talking about these things as they happen, but I didn't really appreciate that prior to 2010, there was no institutional corporate Wall Street capital in a meaningful way in the single-family home market. Now, as of the end of 22, CoreLogic said it was more than 1 in every 5 homes that were sold was sold to a corporate buyer. At the end of June, it was 26% of all homes that were sold to corporate buyers. And again, these are not folks who are looking to fix them up and make them nice so that you and your family are living in a better place and then can hopefully watch those appreciate or at least store value and have that legacy wealth. They want to take that home, take it out of the supply, take that money that a family would make and, from an individual standpoint and then a legacy standpoint and transfer that wealth from Main Street to Wall Street. And, there are all kinds of companies that are doing this directly. Blackstone, which is a private equity firm, does do this directly. BlackRock does it indirectly. So they invest in companies that do this. So they're one level removed,
Right.
Whether it's American Homes for Rent or one of those other big names. But whether it's Vanguard or State Street or BlackRock, all of the big asset managers have a stake in at least one or more of companies whose one of their primary goals is basically this renting the American dream. So they will argue with you and say, well, we're not actually buying homes. Okay, but you're funding the people who are, and that's kind of a pretty small difference in from my perspective. So we'll just clarify that so that they can't come back at us and say that we gave out any misinformation.
I guess it's kind of obvious, but can you just reinforce why less and less people are owning their homes? Why is that one of the most devastating things to occur in terms of wealth in this country?
Absolutely. So, when I say the phrase American dream to almost anyone on the street and say, what do you think of? The first thing out of their mouth is going to be a home. That has been sort of the illustrative picture, the thing that people associate with the American dream. And as I noted, there's a reason for that. This is the largest asset on household balance sheets across the United States. So this is, kind of across households, this is one of the biggest ways that families derive their wealth. And part of the reason, Tom, if you think about it, when you're in the stock market and there's this sort of emotional roller coaster and things go down, you see a lot of individuals who panic and they sell, and then the stocks go up and they go, oh, I wish I didn't do that. And so they're kind of in and out of stocks, and they don't necessarily have that benefit of the duration of that long-term view, which is really how you get the compounding returns. When you have a house, you're consuming it. You may have kids who are in school in a certain district. Like, this is not something where every week you're going on Zillow and you're going, oh man, my house is down $100,000 on the estimate. I better sell it and get me a new one. Like, it's just not how that works, right? So you get the benefit of the duration because you're not emotionally charged in selling in and out of your home like so many people do with stocks and other investments. And that ends up being one of the key reasons, in my opinion, why it has become such a big driver of wealth. Plus, it's something that you have to do anyway. Like, you're either going to give that money to somebody else in terms of rent, or you're going to store it in the value of your home. And so it's kind of a forced behavior because it is a consumable. It's something that you need to do as part of your life. So this is very meaningful from a wealth creation opportunity. because then that means that money that you're spending just goes to someone else. It's a wealth transfer, and that somebody else is Wall Street. And, obviously I worked on Wall Street, so that it's not all bad, and there are people invested in Wall Street, but it's just a different dynamic, right? And then, obviously, as we talked about, the personal sovereignty issues as well.
It's funny. It reminds me of a movie that comes up every year on this show and around the country, and that's "It's a Wonderful Life," which features so prominently, like in terms of the role that housing plays in people's lives, and that ability to own a little home and not have Mr. Potter buy it all up and rent it to you. So this is like a topic that's been around forever, but it just sounds from your book anyhow that things are getting worse and worse.
Yeah, and let me also just double down on that, because you get the media who are now starting. They're really unbelievable. They're starting to say, oh, the high housing ownership is holding back the economy and it's making it hard for the Federal Reserve, instead of saying, oh, the Federal Reserve provided cheap capital to Wall Street, and the government has all of these rules and regulations that not only add to the cost but mean that we can't build, and they disrupted the labor market, so we don't have enough people to work on new housing. So they don't want to talk about any of that. They don't want to talk about those costs that have increased the price of the housing, including Wall Street participating. And then they also don't want to talk about the fact that people's personal balance sheets have been destroyed. So, the inflation is eating into the income that average Americans have, to the tune of pretty close to $10,000 per year for a family. You obviously, for anybody who has debt, that is, especially if it's floating rate debt, is now at a higher rate. And young people have been destroyed by these college loans for degrees that often don't pay an ROI. So even if the price of the houses hadn't increased, the personal balance sheets have been wrecked. And then you've got the interest rates through the roof as well, which is also hurting the supply, because if you're somebody who has a 3.5% mortgage and you want to sell your house, that the trade-off is going to be, your next one is going to be at 7+% in terms of the mortgage. So you're not going to be making that financial trade either. So they really have gotten the average American coming and going when it comes to the housing market.
We're speaking with Carol Roth. She's the author of You Will Own Nothing. You're listening to The Sounds of Film. And Carol, there's so many valuable insights in this book. One of the things that most alarms me, though, is you start writing about social credit scores and how they factor into the new financial world order. Can you explain to our listeners a little bit about what you've learned about social credit scores?
Yeah, so I think that the best place to start with that is probably to look at China, where they have a much more formalized state-level social credit that's very easy to understand. Well, it's not easy to understand from a why are they doing this standpoint, but it's easy to get your head wrapped around the mechanism. So basically, if you do things that the government, the Communist Party there, deems as good things, you get plus points, and if you do bad things, you get negative points. And it could be anything from giving blood gives you a plus point, to saying nice things about the government gives you a plus point. But if you say bad things about the government, it gives you a negative point. And one of the stories in the book that came from NPR is this poor guy named Laude, who was a coal intermediary, and his fortunes changed overnight when the government changed their policy on coal, and it bankrupted him. And because of that, he has bad debts. He now had to go on the blacklist. And they went into some town. He looks up at this billboard, and his picture is on the billboard with a digital billboard that changes, and it had his personal identification number and his name, and it says this person is untrustworthy. And so it really, kind of evokes this, Big Brother comes to life kind of scenario. And so you might go, well, that's bad, but that's China. I would argue that we're in a sort of informal social credit scenario here. And I think what people don't understand about social credit is it's not just about your speech, but it's about your financial opportunities, because usually it attacks your social standing, which is how you get opportunities. It can attack your job, which is your source of income. and then in some cases it attacks your assets. So we had that situation here during COVID, where people were told, hey, you can't go celebrate Thanksgiving, or you can't celebrate Christmas if you haven't taken a vaccine, or you can't go into a restaurant once they allowed those to be opened. If you don't have your vaccine passport, and if maybe you weren't wearing a mask, someone might take a video of you and try to shame you on social media. So we had sort of this informal social credit from that standpoint. We know that by mandate, there were a lot of people who lost their jobs because they were unwilling to take a vaccine. And then we know that obviously they closed down many businesses by mandate. And if you happen to live in Canada and you were part of the Freedom Convoy of truckers, that they actually shut down your bank accounts. And in some cases, there was a GoFundMe that was kind of a fundraiser that was put together here in the United States, and the company, who was a U.S. technology company, worked with the Canadian government, not just the U.S. government, but the Canadian government, to shut that down and ensure that they did not receive access to those funds. And then when a second one came up, it was hacked, and all of the people who were had donated, their names were put up, again, to attack them from a social credit standpoint. So you have that, and then post-COVID, we've seen the government work with Twitter and Facebook. I guess those are the new names, X and Meta, in order to deplatform people who were saying things that were sort of against the narrative. So it's not formalized like it is in China, where there's a point system, but if you're not on the side of whatever the narrative is, you are getting penalized from that social credit. And that's something that technology enables, excuse me, but it also is enabled by people being willing to go along with it.
Carol, I was kind of struck when you mentioned that situation in Canada with the truckers, and they shut down their banking for a while. I thought, well, this is it. Finally, people are going to be like, that's too much. But I guess the norm now is just people hear that the victims are on one side politically or the other, and it just seems like half the population just doesn't care if the victims are on the side that they don't associate with. Then all of a sudden, just this past week, we don't have to get into all the details, but Glenn Greenwald was doing a story about how some left-leaning political site was doing some anti-war stories, and they had their GoFundMe, or I don't know what their financial PayPal or whatever it is, whatever form they use for collecting money from their readers. So it's happening on both sides, but it seems for a while anyhow that people would just take a political side, not really care about it. But the way you describe it in the book, I think it sounds a little scary that people could have all their financial assets frozen, depending on what their views are on any topic, whether it's health related or politically or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I mean, this is the situation we're in this country, which is very unfortunate, is that people are willing to cede their principles because they don't think it's going to happen to them. They're trying to gain a political point. And then when it comes back and it's thrown in their face, and they're the ones that are on the other side of it, oh, well, I didn't mean it for me. So it's like you have to either believe in the principle for everybody, or you don't believe in it at all. And then it's the Wild West. Then our natural rights aren't being protected, which is the whole point of the government here in the United States anyway. So it is a very scary situation. And if the population didn't stand for it, it couldn't be done. They've had the technology to gather this information and analyze it at scale for a very long time. But it wasn't until they tested out, would your aunt or your colleague or your friend turn you in for wrongthink? And then they said, oh yeah, they'd be happy to do that. That they went, okay, well, that really works out well for us. And there's sort of no limit. And then if you think about things that are on the horizon, things they're testing like central bank digital currencies, which would be a currency that would be fully transparent and controllable and programmable by the Fed and the government. Then you say, it's not just they don't have to get the bank on board. They could just literally say, you can't use that particular dollar. And that could be for anything. It could be for their own policy, trying to kill inflation. It could be because you ate too many burgers that month and they don't think that burgers are good for climate change. Could be because you said something that they didn't like. And it really is, in stark contrast to our rights and would be the ultimate in financial and tyranny otherwise.
So what do you feel are the chances that we're moving towards a central digital currency?
Oh, we're definitely moving towards one. The question is, will it be enacted? And if it is enacted, will it be accepted? And then if it is accepted, will it be kind of forced upon us, and how? And so I think they have run, the New York Fed has already run a pilot program with 12 major financial institutions. They published the results about a month or so ago. And this was at the wholesale level, not the retail facing level, meaning bank to bank, not to the individual consumer. But once you open that door, it just paves the path. And that pilot summary was, oh, this was great. This is amazing. And so, that's happening. We know that the Bank for International Settlements, which is the global central bank for all the central banks, has been running these tests on different transactional settlements, and the U.S. is involved in one of those, but China is also involved in another one that's very, very advanced, which could be the, hey, we don't want to be behind China sort of excuse for it. And then the G7, just over a year ago, maybe actually it might be coming upon 2 years now, they put out their principles on a collective basis for retail facing, so consumer level CBDCs. So you don't do these actions, you don't put out principles and run pilot programs if this is something that you're not considering at all. So it is something that we need to remain very concerned about. Certain states are trying to take action, certain individuals are trying to take action, but it should require Congress to vote on it in order for it to be passed. So this is something where people really need to pay attention if they try to sneak it in somewhere. Make sure that your representatives are voting no, and do everything you can to try to keep some level of freedom in our currency, because it would just be a really bad situation. I can't emphasize that enough for everybody if we move in that direction and that becomes an official scenario.
Well, this does sound very alarming to me. However, there are some in the population, a lot of young people, other people as well, who are persuaded that cutting back on the ownership of cars and houses, it's the right way to go. Be better for the environment. It's going to make the world more equitable. What do you say to these people?
I'd say that you are giving up your wealth creation opportunities and your freedom. Cars are a little bit different. It's, unless you have a collectible car as a depreciating asset. So, it depends where you live. If you live in New York City, it may not make any sense for you, but if you live in a rural area or a suburb, it may. And you have to again kind of say you're trading freedom, for not having this. So you have to decide if that makes sense for you. Home ownership is very different. So I think that's one where you really want to change your mind. And the situation right now is a bit dire, but maybe that means that you're looking to work in a different and live in a different area for some time, so that you can have something that is yours, that is your own domain, and where you can be sovereign and you can start taking the money that you would be giving to someone else and investing in yourself. And if we continue the trajectory we are on, and given the level of debt and deficits that we have at the United States, inflation and the debasement of the currency shouldn't be going anywhere anytime in the foreseeable future. So that means that assets over time are likely to continue to rise in value, and you don't want to be priced out of housing altogether. So it's something you should definitely seriously consider. And if you're thinking of lightening up in other areas, just understand what it is that you're trading off.
Okay, one last question. One of the things I love about this book is the way you connect the dots, and we've talked about a lot of different things. Can you just one more time? I know you understand it, but just for our listeners, can you connect the dots between um, why us not owning anything, why us renting everything, as well as things like moving to a digital currency, having social credit scores, are all part of the same plan and what it's all leading to?
Yeah, so it's giving up control. We've lived through this incredible period of prosperity that came on the back of property rights, came on the back of technologies and innovation. If you think back to feudal societies, the only people who owned things were those in the upper elite, the kings and the queens and everybody in that kind of elite society. And then they passed that down to their heirs. And those were the only people who had ownership, and those were the only people who really had freedom. And everybody else, it was a feudal society. They were at the behest of, those people and the nobility. The incredible thing about property rights and about this innovation is it allowed for people to be able to have things of their own that were of value, trade freely with other people, and then take wealth that was normally distributed from father to son and allowed it to spread from person to person. This is a very unique new concept that, if you're a young person, you don't realize how unique and how dear this is. And so we've been through this period where people have understood that you could own things, and by making those investments and putting some skin in the game, we have had incredible prosperity, not just for ourselves, but for people around the world. It's been just an incredible, incredible time. If you give that up, we are now moving in the other direction. You are now becoming an indentured servant again to somebody else who has the ownership. And so you have to play by their rules, and you also don't get those wealth creation opportunities. And so it really is about taking our society as a whole, but more importantly, because I'm an individualist, your individual life backward, not forward. And it sounds really cool and futuristic, but there's never been a time in history where people who didn't own property weren't unfree, unhappy, in many cases starving to death, and sometimes even dying. So it's not usually a good outcome if you look back at all of time that the people who didn't have ownership, things didn't work out so well for them.
We've
And
been
it's unfortunate, if you think about the phrase "you'll own nothing and you'll be happy." Note that they didn't say "will own nothing."
Yeah.
The people who are making this prediction aren't planning to give it up for themselves. And if you watch their behavior, that's happening. And they want you to buy into it. They want you to think you're going to be happy, but history dictates that you won't.
This is such an important book. Everyone, you have to check out You Will Own Nothing. We've been speaking with Carol Roth. Carol, where can people go online to find more information about this book and all your other work?
So the books are available wherever books are sold. Wherever you like to buy your book, you can support your small business bookseller. Bookshop.org fulfills from small business booksellers. If you want to go to Amazon, you can also do that for convenience. Just again, do this with intention. I'm available on the platform formerly known as Twitter, but generally out all through social media. It's Carol J.S. Roth. And I have a website at carolroth.com. I have to ask you, Tom, because I know this is about film and everything. Do I get to share like a favorite film, or do we get to have like a film question here?
I had some. I didn't know if your time was used up, but I'd love to hear what your favorite film is.
All right. So my favorite film of all time is The Godfather. So, and I know you're going to say one or two. Just because it's the OG, we have to go with one. But the one that I'm probably most amused by and that I quote very often is Trading Places. And in fact, I have changed my LinkedIn profile to say that I work at Duke and Duke Commodities Brokers, which is the brokerage firm of Randolph and Mortimer Duke, the two cranky, old, greedy men in in Trading Places. And my entire profile are little kind of snippets about the movie.
Well, if we ever get to speak again, I'd love to ask you some more about your film favorites, as well as I have this sense that you're someone who's very interested in show business, and I know you've done a lot of different things throughout your life. So it comes through in your personality, and it was really a pleasure speaking with you, Carol. I want to thank you so much. I'd love to get into The Godfather. I think there's a lot of themes in that movie that kind of relate to some of the stuff that we're talking about, if you think about it. But this is some
You know,
book.
I'm an advocate for small and family businesses, so it's very consistent there.
There you go. All right, Carol Roth, everybody. You Will Own Nothing. Great, great book. And Carol, thank you again so much for coming on the program. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Take it easy. Bye bye.